Hi everybody, since we launched Firebase Studio a short while ago, there have been a lot of questions that many have been asking across social media, the forums, tech support, and other venues. So in this video, I'm going to go through and quickly answer the top 58 questions that are able to categorize and bucket. And so let's get started. So the first category of questions we're going to look at is questions relating to the relationship between Firebase Studio and Firebase. So question 1, can I use Firebase Studio without Firebase? The answer is yes. Firebase Studio is a development environment where you can build apps using your favorite language and tech stack and so on. And Firebase is backend services and other capabilities. Of course, we make it easy to integrate with Firebase through Firebase Studio, but you can absolutely use Firebase Studio without using any part of the Firebase portfolio of products. Question 2, how is Firebase Studio different from the Firebase console and the Google Cloud Console? Related to my answer in the previous section, Firebase Studio is an environment for building apps. Firebase Console and the Google Cloud Console help you manage any resources you might have provisioned through either Firebase or Google Cloud. They're completely independent. Question 3, does Firebase Studio replace Firebase CLI or SDK tooling? No, Firebase Studio does not. What we do happen to do in Firebase Studio is we do bundle the Firebase CLI. So if you want to use the Firebase CLI without having to do anything extra, you get it out of the box. And if you're using any services, we may provision, thanks to Gemini, any SDKs and resources needed as part of it. But Firebase Studio is an enabler of all these services. It doesn't replace any of them. You still need them as part of your apps functioning. Question 4, do I need an existing Firebase project to use Firebase Studio? Answer is no. There are situations where if you happen to rely on us to generate, let's say, an API key, or you ask us to authenticate and create Firebase resources for you on your behalf, in those cases, a Firebase project may be created for you. You can select an existing project, but you do not need a Firebase project to use any part of Firebase Studio unless you're explicitly choosing to use a Firebase service. Can I integrate Firebase services out of the box? Yes. One of the nice things about our Gemini AI assistants is that it is well trained on all the Firebase documentation and APIs, and there's a Firebase MCP server that also is available for you to use. And so you can use our AI assistant, and you're often just a few prompts or maybe a few clicks away from being able to use a Firebase service if you choose to use it. Question 6, does my app auto-deploy to a hosting solution? The answer is no. As you're building your application, you do have a live environment where you can see how your app is running as you're developing it, but nothing is actually deployed for you automatically. What is the difference between Firebase app hosting and Firebase hosting? So Firebase app hosting is for apps. It's for apps that have front ends and back ends and other things that you might need to orchestrate as part of making sure your web app works correctly. Firebase hosting is optimized more for static websites where you have just a front end, a client-side experience only. So depending on what you're doing, you might opt for one product over the other. You might have seen when you're creating a prototype in Firebase Studio, our deploy button takes you to Firebase app hosting by default. And that's because the Next.js project that we create happens to have both a server-side component to it and a client-side component to it, and that's why we use app hosting. You'll see other parts of the product where we have a deploy button. When you click it, depending on what your project is doing, you might see Firebase hosting being used instead. Can I test Firebase products like Auth, Firestore, Function Storage locally in Firebase Studio? I think what the intent behind it is Firebase provides you with emulators, tell you to test your applications and your code before deploying it live to production. Can you use the emulators inside Firebase Studio? The answer is yes. Some configuration you might need to do just to make sure that the ports are exposed correctly, but you can absolutely test all of these locally without having to do a deployment, just like you would be able to do so locally on your own installation, let's say Visual Studio Code on your local machine. Now let's shift over to questions relating to general positioning of Firebase Studio. Question 9, what is Firebase Studio optimized for? Mobile, web, backend, etc. It's a pretty flexible environment that allows you to support all kinds of tech stacks. So you can build mobile app. We give you Flutter and React Native support out of the box. We give you a cloud-based emulator to make testing mobile capabilities easily. We have web support and backend support, so it's flexible. Your imagination in some ways is probably the biggest limit in what Firebase Studio is really optimized for. Question 10. Can my large team or enterprise organization use Firebase Studio? Yes, absolutely. The one thing you should always keep in mind about large teams is that IT departments, they may have their own requirements and specifications on what things you're allowed to do and not be allowed to do. So definitely double check what those requirements are with what we support in Firebase Studio, just to make sure that everything is running quite smoothly. Is Firebase Studio good for teaching or learning, similar to how Glitch and Replit have been good at that space? Yes, absolutely. One of the things we make it easy in Firebase Studio is what we like to call friction-free onboarding, which means that you can very quickly get up and running with a new project, or you can open an existing project, but we give you a variety of starting points that are in some ways pretty much guided and handheld. So you get a preview, you get your AI assistant, and you get your code editor, all very, very quickly, like less than a minute. And that's often a great spot to help someone learn and get familiar with programming, where they're not worried about how to set up their computer and their environment, but they're focusing more on the things you want to actually teach them. So yeah, great environment for it. Question 12, is Firebase Studio meant to replace Visual Studio Code? No, not at all. In fact, Firebase Studio is built on top of the foundations from Visual Studio Code itself, called Code OSS. So a lot of the familiarity that you might have with Visual Studio Code, that is all going to be available to you in Firebase Studio, especially when you go to some of our coding modes. Question 13, how is Firebase Studio different from Android Studio? So Android Studio is really about helping you build Android applications and all the capabilities and bells and whistles you need for that. Firebase Studio is more broad. It helps you build apps for a variety of tech stacks and frameworks. And one of the things you might have seen is that in Firebase Studio, you can actually build Android apps using Android Studio Cloud, which is Android Studio running entirely in your browser through Firebase Studio. So we are quite different, but we also allow you to build using Android Studio from inside Firebase Studio. So that's pretty cool. Question 14, can I connect and or deploy to non-Firebase backends? Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we have is that Firebase Studio is a pretty extensible platform. You have NixOS as its accessibility layer at the very lower level. It is built on Code OSS, the same one as Microsoft Visual Studio Code, so you're always an extension away from the marketplace, and we also give you a full terminal with file system access. So all of these services, they provide one of the various options to plug into Firebase Studio. You'll be able to be up and running using a non-Firebase service to deploy to any favorite provider you might have. Question 15. How often does Firebase Studio get updates? All the time. And so you'll see that we post release notes on a regular basis, and I'll point to them in their documentation below in the comments on how to access it very quickly. Question 16. Will all of Visual Studio Code's extensions work? It depends. If the extensions are ones that are available in the OpenVSX marketplace, they absolutely will be. If they're not on the OpenVSX marketplace, then you have to install them manually, or you'll have to find an alternate extension instead. Question 17. How is Firebase Studio different from Project IDX? Project IDX was in many ways the former incarnation of Firebase Studio. It's where we started off this whole idea of, can we build a nice environment in the browser that does really good AI-assisted development. Firebase Studio is an evolution of that. So, Firebase Studio is, let's say, think of it as like the version 2.0 or 3.0 of Project IDX. Question 18. Does Firebase Studio meet compliance standards, GDPR, SOC2, HIPAA, and so on? It meets some, but not all. And so definitely take a look at our published documentation on which of the various compliance standards we do support and what the roadmap is for supporting other standards. Question 19. Is Firebase Studio aimed at students, hobbyists, or pros? It's aimed at what we like to call professionals, non-technical users as well as technical users who have the intent of building something that they want to ship and share with others. So from that point of view, yes, students are absolutely aimed at a great target audience for it. So are hobbyists, so are pros, so is anybody else. Question 20. Can I use Firebase Studio for hackathons? Yes, you absolutely can. And in fact, many people have. There's so many posts I see on social media where people have been able to use Firebase Studio as like a starting point where they have a project and then they have a URL that, all the participants open very quickly, and they're up and running without having to spend the usual 20-30 minutes out of a limited period of time to get your environment up and running. So definitely use it. And if you are using it and you had great results with it, definitely ping me. I'd love to see what you all created. Question 21. Does Firebase Studio help me create professional grade apps? Yes. By default, our goal really is that the apps you build need to meet a certain criteria for performance, scalability, security, and all those other things that make up what a professional grade application is. So even if you're building the most basic Hello World app, we like to make sure that it's structured and architected in a way that you can be proud of, or someone who's professional and aware of this, details of it, can be proud of as well. Question 22. Can I use Firebase Studio in my classroom? Yes. you absolutely can. Just note that there are some restrictions on age and logins and so on that you might be aware of. And so as long as you're okay with those guidelines, you'll be able to use it in your classroom and have your students benefit from using Firebase Studio. Now, let's talk about questions related to workflows. How exactly is Firebase Studio going to help me build applications today? So question 23, can I adopt Firebase Studio gradually, or is it all or nothing? Firebase Studio does run in the browser, but it does build on very familiar primitives like Visual Studio Code and Code OSS. So you can absolutely adopt Firebase Studio gradually, but what you can make sure to do is that Git or any kind of a file syncing system is like the common glue layer. So as long as you're doing that, you can use Firebase Studio exclusively, or you can jump between your favorite dev environment until you're confident that Firebase Studio will meet all of your needs. So definitely, it's a choose your own adventure as it goes. Question 24, can I import existing GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, etc. projects easily? Yes, Git support is baked in at the lowest levels of Firebase Studio, so you get great support for any Git provider that has the integrations with Visual Studio Code to be able to do it. Question 25, do Visual Studio Code's keyboard shortcuts work in Firebase Studio? Yes they do. And the only thing to kind of keep in mind is that because Firebase Studio is running in the browser, if any shortcut might be interfering with a browser shortcut, there's some quirky areas where the browser might end up reacting to it as opposed to Firebase Studio itself. So definitely, pay attention to what those rare ones might be and either rebind them or let us know what they are, and we'll change it by default for everybody automatically. Question 26, can I use private Git repository securely? Yes, absolutely. You can authenticate as part of the opening or connecting to your Git repo, and then Firebase Studio will take care of everything from there. Question 27, can I export my code easily? Yes, you have several ways. The most common way is to connect to a Git repo and then make sure it's always synced. So you always have a copy of your files in some remote location. You can also download your files either individually or all of the files in your project by using our download and zip capability as well. Question 28, can I sync changes between a local IDE and Firebase Studio? Now, you can. If you're using Git, you can have files changing between them and have it work. But the other question might often be that you often see you have local dev environment that can connect to a cloud-hosted dev environment. That support we do not have today. It is something that we are actively looking into. Question 29, does Firebase Studio support branches, PRs, and code reviews? Yes, almost all the common Git constructs are fully supported in Firebase Studio, both visually and via the command line, so you should be all set here. Question 30, can I install my own Visual Studio Code extensions? Yes, you absolutely can. Because we give you a file system, you can upload your own VSIX file and then install it directly from there, just like you would on a local VS Code installation. Question 31, does Firebase Studio support Docker? Yes, it absolutely does. There's one line you need to add to our dev.nix file to enable Docker support, and our documentation walks through how to be able to enable that. Question 33, how well does Firebase Studio handle mono repos? It handles it well. The only restriction you might run into is that many mono repos are large. They have lots of files that take up a lot of storage. We don't give you a lot of storage right now by default in the default workspaces, so if you happen to have a really large file size requirements, then Firebase Studio may not be the best choice currently. But definitely if you have just a lot of files but don't take up too much disk space, you should be good. Question 33, what's debugging like? Breakpoints, variable inspection, etc. All those are fully supported. The way we like to think about it is, out of the box, Visual Studio Code provides a lot of debugging capabilities, which Firebase Studio automatically inherits, and each of the tech stacks that we optimize for have their own special flavoring and improvements on top of the baseline experience that is also exposed. So depending on the language you're working on or depending on the framework you're using, you might see additional capabilities that make debugging and making sure your code is running well much, much easier. Question 34, can I instantly preview changes? Yes. For all the templates that we provide, we give you various options for how you can use our web preview or emulator preview or even a backend preview where we're using some kind of a backend proxy to display API changes. And so you can absolutely get that out of the box, or you can configure your own very easily by just making some changes to the dev.nix, which on the forums, a lot of people have posted examples of other frameworks and how you can make instant previews work inside Firebase Studio. Question 35, when will iOS device testing and previews come back? So as many of you know, for historical reasons, we used to have iOS previews running in the browser. You could build an app and you could see it running inside the iOS frame without you having to need providing your own iOS device or macOS device. And so what we found from that is the things that you all wanted was like step-through debugging and being able to see it in a higher fidelity, which we just weren't able to provide properly, in the earlier solution. And so what we are experimenting with right now, which you can see right now with React Native, for example, is we are giving the ability to, as you're developing your app, scan a QR code, for example, and then have your app now running on your phone directly or your iOS device directly. And so you get the much nicer, higher fidelity experience that you couldn't get before. We're constantly iterating on this particular story though. So, the answer used to be a hard no, like a couple of months ago. Now it's a, yeah, scan your QR code. And I'm hoping we have a better story in the near future, as well as we keep evolving this. Now let's talk about the collaboration features and the questions you all have around that. Can I invite teammates to work on my project? Yes, we give you the ability to share your workspace, and all you need is a Google email ID, and now that person has access to all the things that your project is currently doing. Question 37, can I set read and write permissions for what invited members can do? Not yet. Today the experience of sharing is the equivalent of you taking your already signed laptop, giving it to a coworker, and having them work on the code editor and all the features directly from it. And we are working through capabilities that might allow you to have a little bit of control over what they can and cannot do. So right now though, it's as you'll see from all the warnings you see when you're about to share your workspace, you're giving them full access to everything that you would have access to normally. Question 38, do you support live coding or pair programming? Yes-ish. The yes part is when you share a workspace and 2 of you or 3 of you are all working simultaneously on the same project, you will see changes happening in real time from all the other participants who are currently in your workspace. What you don't really see is some of the UI changes you want to have, or some of the capabilities to make it easy to see who's editing what section of code and so on. We're actively working through some of the details on that one. So we do support it, but it's going to get much better as we provide a much better user experience in the near future. Question 39, is richer role-based access on the roadmap? Yes, going back to my earlier question on do we give people read and write permissions? We want to go beyond that and also give like commenting permissions and other kind of things you might often see from a typical Google product, like let's say Google Docs. And so it's on a roadmap, and it's published on a roadmap as well, and we will get to it, hopefully in the near future, so you can actually try it out and give us feedback. Now let's talk about the fun category of deployment. Question 40, can I deploy to third-party services like Vercel or Netlify? Yes, absolutely. Going back to one of the very, very early questions we talked about, does Firebase Studio allow you to work with other backend services? Yes, all these services provide either a command line or a VS Code extension or some API-based format for being able to deploy, and that integrates very nicely with Firebase Studio, so absolutely. Question 41, the one is missing for some reason. What is the difference between previewing and deploying? So when you talk about previewing, your app is running only inside your VM. So what you see in your developer environment is what your app is currently doing. And when we talk about deploying means that now your content, your app, is now running on a dedicated service that's really designed for the world at large to be able to see your content. So you're not kind of like running your website on your development server, like let's say your laptop, but it's running on, let's say, Cloud Run or Firebase App Hosting or Firebase Hosting or Vercel or Netlify or some dedicated service that is better suited to handle traffic and external visitors and so on. Question 41, can I share a preview link without deploying? Yes, your preview link is essentially a link to your workstation, your VM that is currently running. And so as long as your VM is running, people can view your app. But if your VM were to shut down because you're not using it anymore, then the question is going to be no longer there. Now let's talk about questions relating to the environment and the virtual machine, the actual Firebase Studio product that you often end up seeing. Question 42, what environment does my app run in during development? Yeah, it runs on a service called Cloud Workstations. It's a Google Cloud product, and it's a Linux-based VM, and we give you some CPU, some RAM, and some storage. And you can actually inspect it in the terminal by seeing exactly what characteristics you got. And we do vary exactly what kind of machine you get, depending on the project type that you're working on. A mobile project might give you more resources, and a more bare-bones terminal app might give you far less resources. So it's not a fixed VM, the fixed resource that we often provide. Can you tell us the exact VM specs? So it kind of like going back to the answer to my previous question. The VM specs will always vary, but we are also looking at giving you more control over what your VM specs you actually can have. So you might be able to choose add GPU or not GPU, or add more RAM or not add more RAM. And in those cases, you'll get more precise features and specifications. So we don't have it today. Hopefully in the future, we might be able to give you more of that. Question 44. Is Firebase Studio going to be faster than my local IDE? It's a tough one to answer because it all depends on what your local machine looks like. If you're running your current development environment on a very old and aging machine that is barely able to run the operating system and your coding environment, Firebase Studio is going to be much, much, much faster. Now, if you're running your local development environment on one of the latest processors, latest machines, unlimited amounts of storage and RAM, Firebase Studio will probably be a bit slower. And so the nice thing is that Firebase Studio does run in the cloud. It does have some advantages that your local machine may not have, at least the ability to scale, to access more resources. So the answer is mixed. It depends on your local machine setup. Question 45. Do builds run locally or on remote servers? So with Firebase Studio, everything runs remotely. There's nothing that your machine is doing outside of running the browser and running the various things that the browser needs to make sure Firebase Studio renders and can be used properly. All builds, all deployments, all tests, any terminal commands, they all run in our dedicated and secure VM. Question 46. Are your servers geographically distributed? Yes, we have servers throughout the various parts of the world. Our goal really is to make sure that you're not too far away from accessing Firebase Studio, depending on where in the world you are. So your data isn't traveling, many thousands of miles. Hopefully it's traveling only, a shorter few hundred miles or so, just to make sure the latency and things aren't all that too severe. Question 47. What happens if my internet drops? Well, when your internet drops, think of Firebase Studio as very much like a streaming service like YouTube or Netflix or Hulu or your favorite service like that, where if your internet drops, you might get away with a few things that you can still do, but you will lose the ability to sync and get more content from it. So it really does require a persistent internet connection for you to be successful. Question 48. Is there offline support? Not yet. The offline support that we provide today really is through, again, Git syncing. So as long as your code is constantly being synced to a Git repo, you can make sure that changes are now reflected locally as part of your local Git file system. And eventually we do want to do a better job here. So today the answer is no-ish. In the future, hopefully the answer will be a yes. Question 49. How stable are long-running sessions? As long as you're actively using Firebase Studio, where there's input, you're typing and your mouse is moving and so on, long-running sessions will be running just as fine because your VM will be up and running. But if your VM stops running because it detects inactivity, your long-running session will also end up being stopped. Question 50. Do sessions shut down after idle time? Yes, they do. And the idle time varies on a variety of factors, but if you're not using your VM anymore, you're not using Firebase Studio, you're not typing, you're not running, moving the mouse, then it will eventually trigger a shutdown and that VM will now be released for others to use. Question 51. Where is my code stored? All of your code is stored on your own VM, which is a Cloud Workstations product. Question 52. Is my data encrypted at rest and in transit? Yes, your data is encrypted and it's stored only active to your own account. Now, if you shared your workspace with others, those users now have access to your data on your VM as well. Question 53. Is there a storage cap? Yes. As of right now, we give you 10 gigabytes of storage, and we're looking at ways of providing you more storage in the near future. So that way, if there is a storage cap, you have a way of easily expanding to get more storage as needed. Question 54. If I want a more powerful VM, do I have the option to get one? Currently, the answer is no, but we are working through ways where you can actually be able to do that. So stay tuned. Now let's talk about pricing. Any questions related to that one? Is Firebase Studio free? We give you a very generous free tier. So out of the box with Firebase Studio, no need for a credit card. You can get up and running and trying out all the various things that Firebase Studio provides. We do provide integrations for added capabilities like more workspaces, for example, as part of the Google Developer Program. You can sign up for the monthly or the yearly program depending on what's available. And now anything you might use inside Firebase Studio, let's say you're integrating with the service from, let's say, Firebase or from Google Cloud or from a third party, those have their own different billing cycle and so on. But Firebase Studio by itself allows you to get a lot of testing, a lot of evaluation done without having to provide anything in terms of money. Question 56. Does using Firebase Studio consume my Firebase quotas, Firestore hosting, etc.? No, those are completely independent. If you happen to use Firestore or hosting as part of your app development, then whatever quotas you need during development might be used. But using Firebase Studio by default without any services does not add to the quotas for any other product. Question 57. What account does Firebase Studio use when provisioning API keys and Firebase projects? It's going to be the default account. You're signed into Firebase Studio. So if your Firebase Studio account is one that already has access to a Firebase project or has access to billing and all these various things, you will be able to reuse those for provisioning Firebase services. Question 58. Do you offer paid upgrade pads? We do. So today you get access to upgrade your capabilities through the Google Developer Program. And in the future, you might see us integrating with other services as they come up, that are appropriate. Wow. With that, that was our last question, question 58. Now, I do think the number of questions might have been off because I did have a slide where I had the question number mixed up. So it might have been 59 questions or 60 questions. I'm not sure. It's a lot of questions, but hopefully it's helped give you some clarity on some of the top questions that you or others may have been having about Firebase Studio. I know some of these questions had really short answers. If you want to go into detail on any of them, go to the forums and ask, and I and others will be happy to help you out. And with that, I'll see you all next time.